I used to be, for most of my adult life, if people would call me smart, I would get defensive and argue about that. And that was for basically two reasons. The first of them is that when I was in high school, I had a very low self-image with two exceptions, which is that I was good at baking and I was smart. And then later on, I also added that I was good at writing, but I still really only had a self-image of I was good for three things: writing, baking, and being smart. And so then when I was in undergrad, I started to struggle a little bit with getting stuff done, not too much. But I took a developmental psychology course my third semester, and I learned about the fixed versus fluid view of intelligence. And I learned that people who do well on like cognitive tasks, who think of intelligence as a fluid thing rather than something you are, they do better than people who think of themselves as stupid, which is obvious, but also they do better than people who think of themselves as smart. And I'm like, okay, I need to focus on really this fluid view of intelligence, which I've since applied to basically everything. Like I have a fluid view of morality where you're not a good or bad person, you do good or bad things, and you should be trying to do more good things and fewer bad things. And in terms of life too, like living your best life isn't you're necessarily living well or not, it's try to do more things that get you to living your best life and fewer things that detract from that. And so this was important to me. And then I read the book, The Bell Curve, because I have always had an interest in controversial books, especially if they seem credible. And the first part of the book seemed fairly credible, although they opened the book early on. They're like, if you're reading this, you are one of the smartest people in the country, like way more intelligent than others. And I was taking that as flattery, as buttering me up. And I have always been someone who, especially because when I was younger, people would flatter me to try to get things out of me. And so I just internalized, if people are saying really positive things about me, they are trying to get something out of me and I need to run. And I've realized since then, I've seen several other books that have done this, where they're like, you're in the intellectual elite if you're reading this. And it's not about trying to butter up the audience, it's trying to make the audience aware. Most people aren't like this. Most people don't have the advantages that you do. And that was explicitly what they were doing. But I still sort of reacted badly to that. And then they make the argument that it's basically the argument from personal incredulity, which says that if you have such big differences, so there are all these twin studies where you take identical twins, have them raised by different families. You find that in those studies, intelligence is about 60% genetic. And that's the same thing with other personality traits that have been studied with twin studies too, is it's typically around half genetic. But this is happening in the case of middle-class United States generally. It's in the same country and it's generally middle-class people. And so you then address, well, what about the difference between groups, between the middle class and the poor, between people in one country versus another country, between people in the same country at different times? And the argument that they make is, well, it just seems like this is such a big difference that it's unimaginable that it wouldn't also apply across groups. And why? That's the argument from personal incredulity. And as the Flynn effect shows, and as Stephen Jay Gould has discussed in The Mismeasure of Man, like IQ scores for the same people, same groups of people, like Americans who were average IQ 100 years ago would be clinically retarded today. And also, like now people will say, okay, Ashkenazi Jewish people are the smartest ethnic group, but at the time they were considered one of the stupidest, because they had some of the lowest IQ scores, because they started out lower class, and then as they moved up in class, they got better scores. And so if you see in the same country across time such big changes in IQ, then it does not really seem like the heritability applies across groups. And so they were trying to apply it across groups based on argument from personal incredulity. And I was like, okay. And then there was going to be a chapter on race, and I'm like, okay, nope, I'm done. And I DNF'd the book at that point, because I assumed they were going to make the same argument about racial groups. And I'm like, okay, if they're already making this about class, I do not want to see them doing this. I just could not. And so I put the book down at that point, and that ended up... So I know all the reasons that IQ is not really a reflection of intelligence. But then I've been thinking about, okay, well, what actually is intelligence and how would I define it? And I read this book a while ago. There's a YouTuber, World Building Notes, who has mostly retired but occasionally uploads a video like once, twice a year. But she used to upload a lot more often, and she did some of her favorite books, and this one sounded really interesting. And this one was interesting because octopodes, so I always sort of believed in the Machiavellian intelligence hypothesis. And associated with that, so the Machiavellian intelligence hypothesis is that if you live in complex, individualized societies, you are trying to figure out who to cooperate with and when, so you need to remember who has cooperated and who has defected. And to have that, to do that, you need complex, individualized societies, and you need generally long lifespans and long childhoods. And so octopodes, which are solitary animals with short lifespans and short childhoods, go against this, but they do a lot of things that we would consider intelligent. And so I'm like, okay, maybe the Machiavellian intelligence hypothesis explains like what we would think of intelligence in vertebrates, but it doesn't really seem to explain it in cephalopods. And then I finally read this book, and it was actually because I was trying to think about how do we define machine intelligence. I'm probably going to make a video sometime soon about if you want to understand AI, don't read like modern books on AI, read these other books. And this is one of those books that would be on this list. And the point that he was making is that understanding like animal intelligence, what is remarkable, it's what are the cognitive skills that adapt animals really well to their environments. And I've been thinking about that because I think I would sort of define intelligence in two parts now. So the first part of intelligence is what's your ability to distinguish the map from the territory and different maps from other maps and use them appropriately. And so I'll have a video about the map territory distinction at some point because that is an important thing I feel like a lot of people don't get. You see, people tend to either get focused on assuming that maps are territory and mistaking it for the territory, or they recognize that maps are not the territory, and then they argue that the territory doesn't even exist. When in fact, yes, people use a lot of different maps for a lot of different things, but they still have some reflection of the underlying territory that you need to understand. And so I would say that there's sort of two parts to intelligence as I would define it now, and one of them is theoretical intelligence, at least in humans, which is the ability to distinguish the map from the territory and distinguish different maps according to their function. And I'm going to have a video on why frameworks matter more than facts. At some point, I've been wanting to make that one for a while, because that's part of this idea is frameworks are different maps of the same territory, and the more maps of the territory you have and understand their functions, the better you're going to be able to function because it's giving you different perspectives of the territory. It's like the whole story of the blind men and the elephant, where you have three blind men. One is pulling the tail and says it's a rope, one is feeling the legs and says it's a tree, and one is pulling the trunk and says it's a snake or something. I forget exactly. Or the ear and says it's a towel. But those are three different maps of the same territory for, in this case, different locations, but you also have it with functions. And then there's the applied sense of intelligence. And that is the one that I think really matters. That is, how do you figure out how to live your best life day to day? Like, how do you figure out how to prioritize what is going to make you happiest in the long term and then get there, which I have defined. I say my central problem is how do we live the serenity prayer in a world that we have built as humans, but which we are not built for? Because the complexity of our institutions has led to distortions that make it harder to live in ways according to our nature in some ways. And then also ideas, maps that we follow that are misapplied and we use them for the wrong things. And so intelligence, as I would define it, is basically your ability to live a life that makes you happy, which is very similar to what de Waal says, only in this case it's strictly reproductive. And I would say, like, when you have animals with higher cognitive ability, happiness is going to matter more than reproductive success. Although I think that they are linked, and I've told people in my comments who've asked, I think that we all need to feel like we have some stake in the future. And for most of this is probably going to be having kids. But if you don't want kids, it's often going to be being involved with other people's kids, like as a teacher. And if you don't want to be involved with kids at all, it's going to be building a better world in some way, believing it's possible. And I feel like people often get caught up in ideology that is promising to build a better world, but doesn't actually have the ability to do that. And anything that's like a mass movement that requires huge institutional change, I just don't think that's going to make the world better, and it's going to be constant burnout and frustration. But the solution is to make small-scale organic institutions from the ground up. And so even if you don't want kids, even if you don't want to be a teacher or anything involved with kids, to have some stake in the future, it would still be, and it doesn't have to be building an institution either, because it could be you're going to be a writer or an artist. as long as you understand why you're doing it, what you're trying to say. Like, if you want to be a writer or an artist to be a symbolic capitalist, as Musa al-Gharbi would say, well, actually, it comes from Bourdieu, who I've actually got some of his work, but I haven't read it yet. Thought he was out of print, but he actually is in print, although some of it is print on demand, some of it isn't. But anyway, so if you want to be a writer or artist because you want the prestige associated with that, that's not going to make you happy, and I'll probably have a video about that at some point too. But if you actually have stories you want to tell, figuring out how to do that and making that your life might, in fact, make you happy because it is involvement in the future. But I also think, and I would argue, that it's limited to basically 3 generations. Like, we sort of have a sense of 3 generations back, 3 generations forward, and if you try to go beyond that, as a lot of people do, first of all, you can't really know what, especially in the future, what 3 generations forward is going to look like. But also, it just gets too abstract, and we haven't really evolved for that. And I think, like, if you look at human societies, like, living memory is 3 generations. So you remember people about 3 generations back to your grandparents' generation, and people will remember you for about 3 generations generally. And I think that's what we should be focusing on. But anyways, this is sort of getting off the main point, which is just talking about, this is how I've come to define and understand intelligence. Is theoretical intelligence is your ability to distinguish the map from the territory and different maps from each other and what their function is. And then applied intelligence is your ability to use that to build the kind of life that is going to make you happy. And I don't think you can design a test to do that. It is likely that IQ test probably does correlate with that to some degree, but there's also people who would get very low IQ scores who are still happy, and that is ultimately, I think, the goal, is figure out how do you live a fulfilling life that is going to lead to happiness, or at least contentment. And so anyways, thanks for watching. I'm Magpie. This is Leela, and I'll see y'all in the next one.